is a beautiful May day, and we are chatting with Steve St. Martin Sr. and Audrey St. Martin and Steve St. Martin Jr. So I would like to thank you and welcome you here to our very first, what we hope will be many archival recordings of longtime Bloomington members. So, to begin with, I'm just interested in knowing a little bit about your family and what brought your family to Bloomington. If you know anything about that, I'm sure you have a fact or two to share with us.
Yes, my, of course, grandfather, Gideon Pond, great-grandfather, came in 1834 to this area, and at 43 he came to what he called Oak Grove, which was where the brick house is. And my great-grandfather, St. Martin, settled here somewhere early enough to be in the 1850 census. I'm trying to remember. It might have even been a territorial census. Anyway, obviously on the Pond side, Ponds have been members of the church since there was a church here. And my grandfather, Charlie, was raised Catholic.
So this is Charlie St. Martin.
Charlie St. Martin. But he, I don't know, I'm going to bore you. This is kind of an interesting story, though. The Oak Grove, they went to church at...
Assumption?
No.
Oh.
Mendota.
Mendota.
I think Assumption was probably
not there.
too German for the French-speaking people.
Ah.
Don't know that.
Oh.
Anyway, they got invited or heard about an ice cream social that Oak Grove was having on a Saturday afternoon. I suppose Sunday was not legal. At any rate, and Charlie and his wife and 7 children, including my dad, came to the social. I like to think that's where my mom and dad met. And the church, the priest at that church was very upset because that was not something that a Catholic was supposed to do. He told Charlie he was going to go to hell.
Oh my.
And Charlie said, well, we'll see you. And he consequently pulled himself, his wife, his 7 children out of that church and into Oak Grove. And my dad became a very committed Presbyterian. And, well, anyway, so my background in Bloomington and at Oak Grove goes back a long ways.
Several generations.
Yeah.
And Audrey, how about you?
Well, my family, my mother and dad met in Minneapolis, were married. My dad had a job there, so they decided to buy a house in Bloomington. And my mother and I, when I was about 9 months old, I guess, moved here to our location on Penn Avenue. And that was in 1925, I guess. And my folks lived there from then on. We still live on a piece of the property.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, my dad was raised a Lutheran, and his dad was connected with the church in Sweden, where they came from. And my mother had an Orthodox church upbringing in Pennsylvania. She was Slavic.
Ah.
And they moved out here. Anyway, my mom and I stayed out here all winter. practically without anybody around but the two of us.
Oh, my.
But my dad, when the weather permitted, came out. He stayed in with his brother and his father in Minneapolis. He came out weekends.
Oh.
But my mom did most of the stuff. We had a big garden. She did the gardening mostly, and then eventually they brought my grandfather out, built a little house for him, and he lived there. Anyway, I was baptized along with my brother in the St. Luke's Lutheran Church.
Oh.
So I'm not a Presbyterian baptized person. But we used to go there for Sunday school every Sunday. But come summer, they didn't have a Sunday school at St. Luke's.
Oh.
So I asked my dad if I could come here to Oak Grove because I knew a couple of the kids who came here.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, okay. But, so I did that for the summer, and come fall, when it was time to go back to St. Luke's, I asked if I could come here anyway, and he said, sure, so I went to Sunday school there, then I came and went to Sunday school here. And by the next year, when the year rolled around, he kind of said, I give up, or he didn't really, but he said, if I liked being Oak Grove, okay. So I figured that when I was 7 years old, I became an Oak Grover on my own. And then my mother joined after a while, so we joined the church together when I was 12, 13. So that's how my family came
How
to
you
be
got
here.
here.
Been here forever, it seems like.
And Steve Jr., I guess we know
Well,
how you.
No need to describe that.
No, I'm just going to take a quick break here and double check to make sure we are actually recording. And we'll edit this part out. But I just thought, better safe than sorry. And yes, indeed, we are. Okay. Okay, well, what are some of the things that you remember about Oak Grove as a child? Growing up here, you said you chose to come here, Audrey.
They had Sunday school
They
all
had
year
Sunday school
round.
all summer. That was one.
That was the biggest thing for me at that time, when I was real little.
And of course, it was the old stucco church at that time, wasn't it? What do you remember about that building?
Oh, well, some of the classes met in the back room, back of the pews in the sanctuary, primary department or something, and the beginners were in an addition on the north side of the building, and then there were all the junior kids downstairs in the basement, and the kitchen was down there too.
Oh.
So I was in all of those places, but do I dare tell them how I saw you, dear?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
The first time I was aware of him, he was quite a young boy.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And,
I didn't know what you were gonna say.
I just remember he was back in the primary room, which was in the back of the sanctuary, and he was standing on a chair. And I don't know why he was standing on his chair, but that's the first time I saw him. When he was real little, he used to follow his dad around apparently, and somehow or other he ended up on that chair. I don't know how he got down or anything, but there he was.
Well, I was a very bashful child, but never overcome that. And so rather than go to the preschool, what we call the beginners department, I just tagged along with my dad. My dad was Sunday school secretary. He'd go along and collect the attendance cards. There's a card for each child, and he would punch out the particular day that they were there.
Oh.
And anyway, I followed him along. And, I do remember Beth Pond as I think my last year before I started school. I think I relaxed to the point where I was able to sit through an hour of Sunday school. We had Sunday school from 10 to 11, and church from 11 to 12. And my dad, who was very logical, pointed out to the powers that be that there was no interim time, no passing time.
Ah,
And they smiled and said, that's true. And that was, so somehow they managed to go from the end of Sunday school to the beginning of the worship service with very little pause. Anyway, interesting.
and to this day, we are still working on transitioning.
Yes.
It didn't have very far to go though, it was a small building.
That's
and they were, you know, the ones from.
No, but the pews were used for some of the classes, some of the adult classes that the adults, that students would sit in one pew and the teacher would probably stand in the pew in front and face them.
Oh, sure, so they had to.
I
do that.
remember the senior high, I think it was, Wilson Pond taught, met in what was the choir loft, which was practically out onto Penn Avenue, if you remember.
Just vaguely,
Yeah,
it was pretty low.
but anyway, yeah. I remember there were family pews, and my mother had 4 Pond men cousins, actually more than 4, but 4 that had families. And each family, and some of them were quite large, had a more or less a pew on the left side as the preacher faces them. And on any given Sunday, there were probably 30 people surnamed Pond in the church. Though that's changed. I think we have 2 now, Ines and Mary.
Oh, my.
And there were, I believe, at one time at least, I know there were 6 elders, and 3 of them were Ponds. And an elder was elected for a 3-year term, but always re-elected. There was no interim passing, no time to sit out. And so you had the same elders year after year after year.
So it was a lifetime job.
It was a lifetime job. It wasn't that the kind of a job it is today. I know that for a fact, because I served on a session with Ed Knudsen, for example. We met every month, and Ed told us what he'd been doing. And that was pretty much what the meeting was about. That changed when Doyle Hanson and others that have come. Okay.
What do you remember about the early church services? For example, the music, what did you do for music? Was there an organ? You mentioned the choir. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the choir was, by today's standards, very young. I would suppose the median age might have been 25, a lot of high school kids. I joined, I think I was in 9th grade when I joined the bass section. Mother was the organist. Kenneth Johnson, I don't think he directed, did he? He was
I don't think he
I don't
did.
think he stood up and directed, but
He left us on our own.
he prepared the choir on choir practice night.
And he played piano too, didn't he?
Yes, he did play the piano very well.
Played the piano and sang very well.
Mhm. For a while, I played the piano and your mother played the organ for
Yeah, that's
hymns.
Oh.
I don't know exactly why, except I did.
Well, they do it today, Nancy and Judy,
Yeah.
quite often.
mhm. So,
She can tell you, because I think she used to, Kenneth Johnson was unable to drive, being legally blind. But when she got to, high school,
I think so, once I got a driver's license.
she would drive him down to, she made music in downtown Minneapolis.
Oh, really?
And look over the music, help figure out.
For the choir.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
So I didn't play the piano all that well, but I could play it enough so he could tell what the music was and decide if he wanted to use it for the choir. we didn't seem very complicated stuff in those days. But it was fun to be able to do that. I also drove him down to Savage, where there was a camp, an army camp with Nisi soldiers, Japanese American young men, and picked up a couple of those young men that came to young people's meetings at Oak Grove. And one of our openings, that we had with all the other people besides Oak Grovers. Of course, they started out back in the very beginning with Indians being part of the church. So we've been that kind of a church for many, many years. But we had one of those young men who used to come around quite often, and his name was Tad Sasaki. And the other one's name, I never remember his last name, was Chuck
Maida.
Maida. And they were the two that most likely would be ready to come to.
And it was an internment camp then?
Yes.
It was an army camp. It was primarily for people to translate.
Oh.
The Nisis they weren't treated very well to begin with by the American government in World War II. So this was I would say quite a stretch for Oak Grove to go out of its way to include them in not just the Christian endeavor, but the worship service. Yeah.
They were nice young men.
Mission outreach.
Yes,
Mhm.
In
definitely.
all areas. That's
Mhm.
very interesting. Now, Steve, tell me about what you remember from growing up it would have been about the same time I was growing up, in the 50s.
I remember the old building and the basement, which was used for kindergarten during the week, and that's where I went to kindergarten.
Oh, really?
And that old building, I can still vaguely see it in my mind's eye, was a very threatening place. It was a scary place. And Dad would take me for kindergarten, and he'd have to wait for me there, wait with me there until I felt comfortable. As I recall, we got there sometimes and no one else was there. And I certainly was not going to stay in that old basement by myself as a 5-year-old. So
See, this bashfulness is hereditary.
yeah, I'm hoping I might still outgrow mine.
He was afraid of clowns.
Oh yeah,
Oh, well, I
clowns
remember
and
that.
people with masks and
Polka dots on
okay.
the curtain.
Do you remember any particular Sunday school teachers from that?
I think I remember all of the ones that I had, I think. My Aunt Annabelle, I think Ruth Goodrich in 2nd grade, Elroy Goodrich in 3rd grade. And then I had 3 years of Johnsons. I think that was Arnie and Cliff, or Arnie, Cliff and Arnie, and then Roger Parker, whom I'm still delighted to greet when I come here,
Yes.
was my 7th grade teacher. And I think Jack Roddy in 8th. And I cannot remember, I guess I don't remember all of them. I can't remember after that, but
Did you have a high school? There still was a high school.
there was a high school class, and it seemed like there were different people, quite a few different people involved in that.
By the way, someone asked my dad, Kenneth Johnson asked my dad at one time, he said, how do you get your kids to go to church? Because there seems to be naturally a little rebellion sometimes on the part of kids. Don't want to go to church. No fun, whatever. Anyway, the dad kind of scratched his head, and he said, I don't know, he said, but when Bella and I are ready to come to church, the kids are ready. I think such was our relationship with our parents. I hope Steve's going to verify this, or maybe not. Such was our relationship with our parents that if it was something that they did, and we were, of course, we didn't send we didn't get sent to Sunday school.
Mhm.
Both mother and father were involved heavily in any church project. So going to church was something that you did.
That's right, yeah, but I grew up the same way, and I'm sure you did too.
Mhm.
It didn't occur to me not to go to church, it's just where we went on Sundays, you know. And we were there pretty much all morning, you know, it was a natural thing. Do you remember any special, you mentioned the outreach to the camp in Savage, do you remember any other special mission projects or outreach in terms of just maybe short-lived mission work?
Pete the Pig,
Pete the Pig.
I think it was a leprosy mission.
Oh.
Anyway, they had little piggy banks. We brought our pennies, which is not such a trivial amount of money in those days, and put them in Pete the Pig. I remember that. There also was the son of a former pastor, name will come to me too late, who ran a mission in somewhere, Asia somewhere. Anyway, and they were, we, Oak Grove, supported him to as much as extended. There wasn't much money back in those old age.
No.
But there was some emphasis on the mission.
Was there a tradition of church picnics, or, I remember when I was growing up, there was a harvest festival.
Oh,
Do you remember, was that a fundraiser, or was it just more of a fun gathering time, or?
It,
I'm not sure where the money went for that.
I remember it because I helped kill it.
Oh, did you?
It started out as just a fun get-together, and they did charge for the meals. And then it became a kind of a money maker, and there were booths and people could buy things, and, white elephants or whatever you call them. Anyway, and it became a pretty big deal, and it occurred to me at one time, I made a motion at the annual meeting that we cancel it. It didn't go over very well. But then the ladies themselves killed the women who had, of course, were most heavily involved in the preparation of the dinner and so forth. They just decided that they weren't going to support it anymore either, so it died a natural death.
A natural death, okay.
But it started out as a kind of a homecoming dinner. Yeah.
That's what I thought. It was originally called the homecoming dinner.
Yeah.
And I remember rummage sales too, you know, do you remember having, was that mostly a women's
Yes, I think so.
organization?
Oh, yes. Who but the women would gather up stuff to sell, so, yeah.
And most of the women, I'm sure, were home during the day.
Oh, yes.
So,
Most of us, I think, were non-workers for money.
Not unusual. The women did most of the work and the men got the offices.
that's the way it
Okay,
was.
when you were talking before about our outreach, I thought about Happy Daniel.
Oh, I remember that
Happy
name.
Daniel.
Yeah.
We still hear from him all the time. He's got an orphanage kind of place in India. And he sends us like Christmas cards and whatever. but
Really?
We, the church supported a lot of what he was doing while he was here too.
I remember that name. Now, did he have a connection with Oak Grove? Other
No,
than just,
this was when Doyle Hanson was pastor. He decided that Oak Grove needed a personal outreach kind of thing. And after Daniel went back to India, he was going to school here. He was going to, I don't remember what he was going to be.
Yeah.
I don't think he ever finished, but he went back and is still involved in Christian work. But then Winston Schondorf, who was African of some
I don't remember.
kind.
Yeah.
If Ann were here, she could tell you more.
Do you
She's
remember
not.
him?
Yeah, I can't remember what country he was from though. But I remember him.
And he became a doctorate. I think he stayed
Oh,
in
yeah.
the United States.
I remember that. Didn't take whatever he learned back to his own people, but stayed here to be, somewhere in the United States to be a doctor.
What was his name again?
Winston
Winston.
Schondorf,
Schondorf.
Schandorff, maybe?
Don't remember.
I'll have to ask Ann about that, see if she remembers anything. What do you remember about hard times in the church? You mentioned there never was very much money, and I know the Great Depression, of course, would have been a real hard time for Oak Grove. What do you remember about how Oak Grove dealt with problems like that?
I never was good about money, so I don't know if they did.
Well, I know in the early days, before my time, I know that some of the pastors just didn't get paid their promised salaries. And I know when Kenneth Johnson came, he was still a student at Augsburg. Yeah, he was at Augsburg. And was not ready to be ordained. So they maybe solved it by getting people who they could pay less to.
Who weren't actually ordained yet.
Yeah, he was ordained after he came here, I think that's right. He was the first pastor I remember. Robert Hay was baptized me, but I don't remember the occasion.
Kenneth was a good guy. He came back from North Dakota. Where was he? In Minot?
Devil's Lake.
Devil's Lake.
Devil's Lake, yes.
To marry us.
Yes, he came back to marry my folks and to baptize me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we should tell her about our newsletter.
Yeah, Kenneth started during the war, World War II. Started writing a newsletter, a monthly newsletter to all the servicemen.
Oh,
And
We helped him.
when he left
We had helped him before.
oh.
in the spring of '45, and of course the war was winding, well, the European war was winding down. Anyway, he asked Audrey and me if we would send the newsletter out. So I remember doing that. We also printed the morning bulletin.
Richard.
It's about yay long on a half sheet of paper.
Really?
We had to use a terribly picky kind of,
Mimeograph?
mimeograph.
Well, you get more ink on your hands than
Yes,
you do
Back in
anywhere else.
the, we did most of the
You know all
work
about
back
I
then.
do.
So we made a newsletter, had to write what was going on in the church and sent it to all
And you sent it
all
to
the
the,
guys overseas
oh,
especially.
okay.
We had
did
this-
that for quite a while.
We had a service flag hanging in the front of the church, and there was great rejoicing, as there should be, that all of the stars were blue. It's still down here in the archive somewhere. You could find it. None of them anyway were gold stars. They all,
Oh,
everybody came back.
so they all came back.
And of course, some people attributed that to the power of prayer. Far be it from me to argue with that, but other churches prayed for their, okay.
You mentioned Christian Endeavor. and I know my mom used to talk about Christian Endeavor. Tell me some of the things you used to do when you got together as
It was Sunday evening,
young adults.
and it was a forerunner, I suppose, of the Westminster Fellowship. But then a Sunday evening, and then there would always be an evening vesper service also that some adults would come to. But this was for junior high, senior high
I think.
kids. Oh, there'd be just lessons. They have I remember competition on go around the room and give a Bible verse, and you couldn't use one that had already been used. It seemed like a spell down.
Yes.
Everybody wanted to say, Jesus wept. But once he was used, somebody else was used, that was it. We used to go to Lake Coronas, wasn't it, for camp? With the young people.
Out at Painesville.
Yeah, Painesville.
Yeah.
Used to go for that. Beth Pond was the cook for us out there, as I recall. I think she was the cook. She was there, you know, and many of us cried on her shoulder at times for one thing and another. Mostly we didn't want to be there too long. I mean, you know,
Homesick.
I was a worrier, worried about my parents at home when I wasn't there. But,
Now, Beth Pond was a teacher, wasn't she?
Yes.
yeah.
She was
she home ec?
Home ec teacher.
Home ec. She
I
taught in the
remember
Bloomington
that.
schools for quite a few years. Yeah.
Who were some of the leaders of the Christian Endeavor then? Was it pastors or was it?
No, Nina Hill, I remember.
Oh, Nina, yes.
I'm thinking about Mrs. Norson, which wouldn't mean anything to anybody now, but I think she was involved also. Maybe Mrs. Dean, that's another name that isn't going to mean anything to anybody.
That was that?
But it was primarily, sounds like it was primarily female, didn't it? But lay people.
Lay people. How about pressing social issues? In reading through some of the old records, I've read references to dancing, bans on dancing, and the old liquor laws and how the community reacted. Do you remember any controversy like that within Bloomington as a community about morals or?
Well, I know that the Wilson Pond from Oak Grove Church led the anti-liquor crusade, if you please, in Bloomington, and was successful in keeping it out for quite a few years. I remember that much. There wasn't that many controversy within the church that I recall.
No bans on dancing or
if-
anything?
Oh, dancing.
What was that play about that I was in, and Stan Pond was supposed to be my
Yeah,
father?
I remember that.
And that had something to do with drinking.
That was an anti-drinking. In the play, the young husband comes home drunk and beats his wife to the point where she dies.
Oh,
And he's on trial for murder. And she played the part of
The daughter.
the daughter.
I remember crying, Daddy.
I still remember hearing her say, "Goodbye, Daddy," you know, very plaintively and very much a tearjerker, because he's obviously going to go to be hung by the neck or whatever execution was in at the time. Yeah, I remember that. I wasn't in it, but I remember it. You made quite an impression on me, even then.
Did I? I'm glad you noticed me.
Steve, what are your early memories about people in groups and
Well,
Sunday school and whatever.
you mentioned social issues. I remember that, I think this was when Ed Knutson was pastor. There was a book written called Black Like Me, written
Yes.
by a white man
Ralph Ellison.
who
yes.
Had his skin dyed and so on, and passed as a black man and experienced some of the prejudice. Anyway, there was a lot of interest in that book, and as I recall, there were copies of that paperback book throughout the pews for people to take home and read, and I did read some of it. So that was a social issue that was brought home to people. I guess Uncle Ed must have felt rather strongly about that. I assume he did.
Well, what about weddings and baptisms and funerals? What do you remember about traditions surrounding the rites of passage, so to speak?
I remember about baptism sometimes in the newer church, you know, not the real old one, but the next one, you know, around that way.
Yeah.
We used to listen or watch some of them, and when some of our kids were baptized, they all cried. So I thought that was a sign of acceptance, you know, of what was being
Taking
done.
it seriously,
That was
yes.
a serious thing, and that called for a few tears.
Now, you mentioned that Kenneth Johnson came back to marry you. Was that in the old stucco church, or did we have the new?
It was in this,
It was the old church.
the old church, the one that for us was the old church, yeah. Yeah, we had, and you mentioned controversy a lot, somewhere early in this conversation. One of the most serious controversies was the August Beck. There was some cloud about did he or did he not make an improper advance to a young woman who happened to be a pond. And so there was the session voted by a narrow vote to let it pass and not do anything about it. But some of the members who were pawns were more anxious to have him get rid of the rascal. And they finally got to the point where Presbyterian inserted its bishop-like, is that right? I think Presbyterian acts like a bishop. So they moved him. They moved Mr. Beck, who was very popular with some of us. Anyway, and it was during that interim that we were about to be married. So there was no pastor. I think Ed came 1st of October, and we were married on the 17th of September, Constitution
He
Day.
remembers it.
Anyway, I guess that was controversy, and of course the most recent controversy, well, one of them, a more recent controversy, and you remember this one, when the church decided it couldn't deal with two associate pastors, so we had to get rid of Deb and Frank. And there was a fair amount of unhappiness over that. By the way, on this earlier one, I talked about 1947, 48, there weren't many other games in town. You didn't go to Oak Grove Church. There was St. Luke's up the road, and
Was Bloomington Ferry?
I think they're Oxborough Methodist, but it was very much a struggling church.
And was Bloomington Ferry?
The Bloomington Ferry may have gone by that time, I'm not certain. But that was it. There was Assumption Catholic Church across the belt line. At any rate, so we stuck it out, and the people you were mad at, after a while, Ed Knutson came. He worked so hard and refused to recognize factions that pretty soon you were working alongside of him and working alongside of the guy you were mad at. And so it settled down.
Let's see. Oh, leadership positions. What do you remember about, for instance, serving on session or people that served on session? Trustees, I know there used to be a board of trustees and the elders, and then there was deacons, of course. What memories do you have of serving on various boards and committees?
Well, I remember being on the first board of deacons, probably 1952. It's in your book. I'd have to check that. And I think at that time the deacons were kind of struggling to find what are we supposed to be doing. And I never did very much. But some of the other people, Eleanor Berg and Alice Miller and Ruth Goodrich, were very active, and primarily what the deacons did was to go around visit with new potential members. Of course, Bloomington was growing by leaps and bounds at the time. So I think that's sort of what they fell in. Besides having a rose for every
Every newborn.
child, every newborn, I think.
Yes.
I remember delivering one to Helen Peter when her youngest was born.
Remember we had the cradle roll too. Remember that?
Yes.
Remember that big board with all the pictures of the babies, and you couldn't keep up. They were being born so fast
Yeah.
during the 50s.
Yeah,
Well, Mom was one of the first women to serve on the session.
Were you?
I was the third one, and in
Wow.
those days, you never had more than one woman on the session.
Is that right?
At the time. It was,
Catherine Dewey.
Catherine Dewey was the first one, she served for 3 years. And then Alice Miller served for 3 years, and I was next and served for 3 years. And while I was there, because I was the woman, I suppose, I was the clerk of session for several years, which was not a job I liked.
No?
Trying to keep track of things and whatever.
Now, when would that have been? Was that in the 60s then, or late
Wow.
50s maybe?
You remember?
67.
67?
The reason I remember is this was nearing the end of Ed Knutson's tenure. He had announced his plan to resign as of the end of May it's 67, that's right. Anyway, and Easter morning, Audrey got a call from Flo Knutson, Ed's wife, saying, hey, Ed's in the hospital. This is not Easter morning, I'm sorry, Saturday morning before Easter. And they were planning 3 services. And here's Ed in the hospital, and there was no associate at the time. Frank Walkup had already left.
He was it, so I had to scout around to find somebody to come and preach, and that was Mittens.
Jerry Middens.
Jerry Middens, I remember.
He had asked whether he could be considered as an interim pastor, which eventually he did become. And so I suggested, I think, or she figured it out, hey, maybe because he'd like to be an associate, interim pastor, maybe he would come and take care of those services for us. And he did very nicely.
That was one of the things that I really didn't like all that much. I had to call everybody before session meetings, make sure people knew they were supposed to come.
Sure.
So I spent a lot of time, it seemed like, phoning
On the phone, yeah.
on the phone with these people.
Thank
I
heaven
never
for-
did like telephoning, so.
Thank heaven for email nowadays.
No, yeah.
It's a lot more efficient.
It's assuming you have
Ah,
facilities
yes.
to do email.
That's true. What about Presbyterian and General Assembly? Did you ever have any connection with that, or were you ever delegates or?
You served communion at a General Assembly.
Yes, but I don't remember what year. She's the one that
68,
remembers you.
probably. I remember Doyle was, they wanted a lot of women. They wanted to have the women be prominent.
That must have been when I sang in the 1,000-voice choir. Maybe you did too, Priscilla. But about that,
No, I
when
don't
the General Assembly met in Minneapolis. And
What year was it?
I was in high school, so 67, 68.
Yeah, I would have been at McAllister then.
Oh, you
so,
were, yeah.
I was-
So anyway, it was quite exciting to sing with 1,000 people in that auditorium downtown. I don't remember exactly where.
Didn't I sing too?
I bet you did. You probably did.
I remember being
singing that.
in this big choir, we had to learn that music and that I wasn't familiar with.
Oh,
I guess maybe that's right. I
You
forgot.
must have too.
I suppose I did.
you might have even been a delegate.
We did lots of things we don't remember.
Oh, dear. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. I guess what I'd like to hear about is, you can get a little philosophical now and think about Oak Grove's years of existence. What are some of the major changes, maybe for the good and maybe for the not so good, that you have seen develop over the years that you've been here?
Dress code.
Ah, yes.
You never, back in the 30s, would have seen somebody serve communion wearing jeans.
Those were work clothes.
You would have, they would be wearing a suit
Mm-hmm.
and a coat.
Yeah. And
Maybe if it was a hot day and we didn't have air.
you didn't see very many people wearing shorts either. I remember some women that shouldn't have been wearing shorts anyway. And they came to church, I mean, that was kind of a no-no.
But that's a, well, maybe it is trivial, but it's, in terms of, liberal is a kind of an overused word, but I think in a lot of matters, there's more acceptance of new ideas, for example, and the willingness to at least tolerate thinking about them. Got a lot of respect for people who don't agree with this with the minister, for example, on a matter of a war or a matter of rights of homosexuals and so forth. They don't necessarily agree, but they're willing to come to church and still be a part of it. There are those who, if somebody, I'm editorializing here.
That's fine.
It seems to me I see more willing to accept other points of view and maybe even appreciate other points of view.
Or at least entertain them and think about them
Yeah.
rather than saying.
I'm aware that we're less sort of strict, you know, the old Presbyterians had to do this, 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 this. We have lots more stuff in between this and this and this these days. You
Well,
know, like singing some of the stuff we sing these days that we've never gone over at all in the old days. So I see that change
Yeah, and the service.
in the service
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah, and the kinds of anthems, I know I've noticed this change over the years
And
too.
the extra singing stuff they do, you know,
Instruments and whatnot.
yeah, well, the instruments, yeah, but the singers that sing what I used to
Oh.
think was the camp songs.
Yes,
I used
yes.
to sing those at camp
Wellspring singers,
when I
yeah.
was a kid. Now we sing them in church every other Sunday or so.
Maybe the informality.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so.
That's,
I think, and that's
that's a good word.
a reflection of
Sure.
society, you know, we're just a lot less formal. I mean,
Mhm.
heavens, I wore white gloves to church every Sunday, so did my mother, everybody did, you know. And
Yeah.
things have really changed.
And you wore a hat
You wore a hat?
in those days. Although I never did that very much. I usually had a baby in the arms. No hat then.
Well, how do you see the Presbyterian Church in the future? I mean, if you could look ahead maybe 20 years, 25 years, but do you have any,
I
are you afraid to look?
no, I just would hesitate to predict because who knows?
Yeah,
Steve, you've studied Calvin more than the rest of us, and
Well, I'm not sure Calvin would fully approve of our current beliefs necessarily. You can attend a lot of worship services in this church and not hear about predestination. But the interesting thing is that in American Presbyterian history, there have been many Presbyterian churches. There was the Associate Presbyterian Church and the Reformed Presbyterian Church and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And most of those churches still exist, albeit many of them are very tiny, have only a few congregations. So to me, that says that there will be Presbyterians of some kind for many years to come. May not be very many of them, but I think there's a stubbornness about the whole Presbyterian tradition that will probably see it through, at least so that it won't wink out of existence. Whether it'll be a force within the church universal, I don't know.
we do have staying power, don't
Will probably be different.
we? Undoubtedly.
They'll have lots more of the kind of stuff we're beginning to see now, like you say, the songs and the whatever. I think it'll be even more, we'll probably get to be more and more like other churches,
Yeah,
Mhm.
other denominations perhaps, I don't know.
which is not a bad thing, I don't.
No, we aren't gonna go back to the kind of thing that we knew as little kids.
Right, right.
But that's growth, that's change.
I see a little more movement toward ecumenicalism,
Oh,
you know, and that's kind of what you're getting at. In terms of, especially with our youth group now, getting together with other denominations and
Mhm.
for instance, the Good Friday service that they had this year. Kids from all over Bloomington getting together and doing things together, mission work and
Mhm.
that sort of thing. And I think I'm seeing that trend, maybe because our numbers are dropping a little bit, and some of it is, we don't have the massive numbers of kids anymore that
No.
in
No.
fellowship and Sunday school. But anything else you have to add? We've covered an amazing amount of ground here. Oh, in about an hour. Steve, anything that you wanted to add about? It's been just-
I enjoy coming back to visit here
Uh-huh.
and seeing some of the old people and seeing a lot of young people in this, there are a lot of young people in this congregation. And it's good to see that.
yeah, I'm glad to see that there are more. The church is growing, open and growing.
Yes.
Is that the right expression? I'm delighted to see that.
And I think we we will still continue to be a mission church.
Oh, no doubt.
Well, you better have a mission.
You know, board and mission and still
That's one of the
reaching out.
big reasons to be a church.
Well, stop
Thank you.
stop the music here.
Thank you for,
Thank you. My goodness, this was wonderful.
Yeah, we learned a lot.
A real treat for me.